PE, I just wanted to create this video as an introduction for today's class as usual before we join our Zoom. During today's Zoom, we're going to be in breakout rooms for a lot of the time, allowing for small group discussion, and I ask you to use that time wisely. I'll join in with each of the groups. The task that you're going to be doing is a little bit more extensive than the last time we used breakout rooms, which was a pretty simple draw of the graph. But before that, I just wanted to make sure everyone is at the same point, which I like to do quite often, as you know. And I thought I'd do that using YouTube this time rather than the start of our Zoom. So here's what we've covered so far and what I feel like you should be comfortable with, knowing that we have a SAC coming up very soon. If you look at the SAC timetable, I believe it's next Thursday. So Mr. Smith and I are writing that and making sure that we're being very fair in what we're asking you to do. And there's more information to come today. Fuels. Hopefully you're comfortable with knowing carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and adenosine triphosphate as the fuels and what those things do inside the human body. So, in terms of carbs in particular, the GI, the glycemic index, how quickly it's going to break down and provide energy, but also in terms of all of those food fuels, the carbs, proteins, and fats, what their daily intake should be, what their purpose is. What are their names when they're inside the body? For example, the carbohydrates become glucose when they're transported around and glycogen when they're stored, the free fatty acids and the adipose tissue, okay, and then the amino acids for the proteins there. And also some examples of how we can consume and digest different foods to create the purpose of each of those food fuel sources. Hopefully by this stage the word resynthesis is one that's comfortably in your brain about putting ADP and P back together, and what is needed is energy, which comes from those food fuels. The difference between aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise, aerobic meaning with sufficient oxygen and anaerobic meaning without the presence of sufficient oxygen. Energy system continuum, that graph. You should revisit that graph now that we've covered all three systems in depth, and have a look that it makes sense to you about when each of those three energy systems becomes dominant for somebody who is training at a maximum threshold. Then we covered the three energy systems in a lot of detail. ATP-PC, anaerobic glycolysis, and the aerobic systems, both the glycolysis system in detail and mentioning about the lipolysis system requiring more oxygen but yielding much more ATP resynthesis. These are some things throughout the chapter that we haven't covered yet, and yet we need to cover prior to that SAC. So the first one, LIP, lactate inflection point, OBLA, onset of blood lactic acid, okay? So that one there, we really need to cover those ones. And in particular, bicarb soda. How can that help us with the buildup of acids inside our muscle? So that's on page 121. We'll cover that today. There's an item known steady state, and there's a video about Strava that you'll be watching at the end of today's lesson. And that video mentions steady state, and you're going to be doing that in our prac session tomorrow. There's a fuel table that I really like on page 127 that we're going to cover. There's a graph on page 129, or two graphs, that really help our brain understand what's going on. And then going back to that steady state that I mentioned before, there's also something called oxygen deficit and EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. That's across page 131 and 132. That should be added to your checklist of things that we really need to cover. Before you join today's Zoom, there's one more video that you need to watch, and hopefully you're feeling comfortable with what I've just explained to you. That video is going to give you a bit of an insight to one of the elements that we're going to start with today. I won't be doing a recap at the start of today's Zoom. This was today's recap. I'll be getting straight into the new content so we have enough time for the breakout rooms and talking about tomorrow's class.